Hey everybody, I am sitting here with my dog Bayou, who insists that I pet on him since I've been working on the computer for a while and have not given him attention. This is quarantine time after all. But I have put together a new presentation. I wanted to share it with you, going over the perspectives that we take in the class, thinking about the way we think about history. I mentioned this for those of you who haven't completed your reflection yet, that this would be useful to you. And for those of you who have already, kudos, don't worry about it, we're moving on. But think about history. What is important when considering how to examine the past, right? What is important for us to consider? We want to use a critical thinking lens, right? We want to make sure that we're trying to be objective. And part of the way that we do that is we have to start by considering the ways in which we approach history. How do you feel about the history? How do you feel about the past? Do you have a bad taste in your mouth because up until now history has been just rote test taking based upon dates and facts and names of people? Yeah, that right there can be quite tedious. And what is it, about that kind of learning that makes you want to fall in love with history? I fall in love with history because of the stories. It's all of our history, and this is U.S. history from 1865. So all of our stories together in the eras in which our multiculturalism really begins to explode. And it's stories that we can all share that also share all of our identities. It's the stories of the open West, where far away from the center of government on the East Coast, LGBTQ groups were able to express themselves in their identities at the turn of the 20th century, far before you'll see it in the more quote unquote, constructed and civilized areas of the country. But out west, there was a sexual exploration and revolution that was coming in identity. It's about the Eastern Europeans that come to the United States at the turn of the 20th as well, bringing with them a new kind of culture, and also raising this question of what whiteness is, what being American means. And through that, we get culture wars that take us to prohibition. It's about women and the struggle for an equal voice, and how when we look back on the many protests that we know we've experienced ourselves in our own lifetimes, understanding that those organized civil disobedience protests, the first ones in which become examples for later movements, the first march down Pennsylvania Avenue was the Women's March in 1913. It's about Wong Kim Ark, who pushed the Supreme Court to define what equal protection meant under the 14th Amendment. It was this gentleman who forced the Supreme Court to say, yes, there is a protection called birthright citizenship, and it does not matter what nationality your grandparents were. If you were born here, you are an American citizen. It's about Ida B. Wells and the bravery of standing up in the face of hatred and racism in the heart of the South, and using your editorial voice, using your business to point out the lynchings, the disparity, and the unequal treatment of Black men. It's about when we have our leaders who even challenge the rule of law itself and what it means to have a political voice. It's about the unions, the class movements, the employees and the laborers who fought to require the states and require the federal government to create protections for children, for women, for equal pay, for 8-hour workdays, for safe environments in which to work, and fair pay and benefits. It's for the voices of those moments when we are on our knees, but finding those heartbeats of humanity when we come together, right, to lift up our whole communities. And when we fight together to lift up our whole communities. Our stories in this class make up the bulk of our content. There's no rote memorization here, but lessons to be learned and voices to be respected. Right now, you are engaging with the Indigenous Plains narratives, and you see how the children were taken away from their families. And what comes out of that is heartbreak and devastation. But if we use an empowerment narrative, rather than victimization, we can see that by bringing all of these children from these different nations together and forcing them to be together, it brought those communities, those indigenous nations together under a pan-American unified voice, the American Indian movement, that becomes the strongest voice for indigenous rights in the United States in the 20th century. Our stories are about our heroes and how we are represented and how we respect our leaders. Our heroes, both across the seas and here at home, how we respect them, and how our rights and our laws and our protections expand over time to be about including all of our voices. That's what history is to me, and that's what I hope that you'll learn in this class. But we have to think about the ways we think about history, and we have to think about how our own perspectives play out in the ways in which we hear different types of narratives. Our identities play a major role in the way we understand history. So it's important that we take a few minutes to think about the ways in which we think about the world and why we think about the world in those ways. Woo! Now we're going into psychology, right? But the truth of the matter is, we're all individuals. Most of us, raised in cultures that in some way celebrates individuality. And what that means is, over the course of our lives, we have cultivated our identities. It's very healthy to do that. It's important that we do that. We identify in small groups. And by doing so, we can identify ourselves in the larger social structures in which we find ourselves. So think about how you identify, think about the places in which you're connected to and what those narratives are and how they might, if gone without evaluation, shape the way you look at other communities. Think about your preferences, right? Think about who you are and where you're going, the influence of your family. These are cross-intersectional concepts, and they're beautiful because it makes up who you are. I am a Southern female biracial historian, right, who's very independent and is a social activist. But the problem is, I'm also a Saints fan. And up here, it seems like there's not a lot of Saints fans. There's a lot of Patriots. But where I come from, no. The Saints, now that's the right team. The Pats, ooh, that's the wrong team, right? But when I let my identity impact the way I view others, it can become an us versus them mentality, especially if what I'm basing my identity on are the experiences that I have had that are unique to me and the ideas in which I have formulated my identity around concepts of faith, concepts of family, concepts of politics, right? And yes, for me, all of the ways in which I view those concepts are correct, but my beliefs, right? My subjective identity is not an objective universal truth. And so we have to be aware of our lenses, the good ones and the bad ones. Because if we are aware of our lenses, then when we engage in critical evaluation of the past, we can be careful to consider the fact that we have these biases. And it's not just us. We'll find it in the historical narratives. I asked you to think about that in week 1 with the heroification, right? Historians have different, interests. They come from different backgrounds. You can have an economic historian who's going to tell a very different story about the capitalistic culture and the economy of the monarchy, right, as it impacted colonial revolution. It's going to be a very different perspective and take than a social historian who will look at the first contacts and interrelational interactions between indigenous peoples and colonists. So we have to understand that, not only have we have to be aware of our own lenses, rather, but we have to be aware of others' lenses. And again, this us versus them, it's about this idea of these small group identities that we hold. I'm a regionalist. I'm a Southerner. I really am. I didn't even realize how much of a Southerner I was until I moved up here. Wow, it's beautiful to experience something different, but it does feel, a bit foreign in ways. And people are kind and things seem familiar, but they also seem different. And I could focus on those differences. I mean, after all, I'm the one who's uncomfortable. But the thing about humans, the thing is that we have a lot more in common than we actually do that's different. This map right here is of the human diaspora. Diaspora meaning the migration of people out of one area and into another. And as you see here, we all originated somewhere in central to west to south and central to south and west Africa. And we began this migration, this movement out. And first settlements of early civilizations originate in Egypt. We see then in the Indus Valley civilization, in the Yellow River, right? All of these areas where different groups settled down and began to create cultures based upon their environments. And the funny thing is that you've got about 6 different cradles, about here, 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 and then here and here, right? Our 6 cradles of civilization. They don't talk to each other 20,000 years ago, right? And yet we all evolved in similar ways. We all evolved where we settled around a river. The only exception to that is Greece, right here. It's on the sea. We all began to domesticate animals and domesticate the land in ways so that we could store up food and share food so that we could then have more babies. And from there, we share the practices that help us survive on those lands in which we live. And we utilize the resources around us to create identity. And from there, we expand, but we did it everywhere. We just did it differently because we were in different areas of the world. Not because we were different. We share much more in common than we have that is different. Uh-oh. And let me show you. Although small group identification, this is the United Nations Human Commission on Civil Rights. Although small group identification is a healthy way to identify, the us versus them mentality, right, can be very harmful. We have these similar backgrounds and habits and social statuses, and we think we have these things that are different, right? These bubbles in which our identities are created. Our identities are not static. There are things that you have come to appreciate now that you did not appreciate before. There are ways in which you have grown and blossomed. And there are times when you've changed your mind. And that's because we all evolve. And if we're aware of that, then we can find the ways that we connect. What commonalities do we share as people around the world? One of my favorites is the Golden Rule. In the Christian faith, the Golden Rule, right, is do unto others, right? Do unto others as you would have done to you. Well, the thing about the Golden Rule is that some form of this idea, this lesson, exists in all major religions and most minor religions. Think about that. across the world over time, as people have established their origin stories and made sense of the world around them with the formation of faith. In that, somewhere when the rules were laid out, every one of our groups that we have found had some form of the understanding that we must treat each other fairly. I ask that you do that in our class. I ask that you give it a fair chance, and I ask that you consider the narratives within the larger context and consider the ways in which you've been taught history. And think about whether or not those earlier ways of teaching and learning were equitable to different groups of people who have also shared in, contributed in, and gave their lives so that we could have a democracy. Have those stories been given equitable voice? And what do you need to do in order to understand and hear those truths?